It was a dark and quiet night. The streets were empty as Mary walked back from the church, holding her 4-year-old daughter close. Her steps echoed through the silent night as she approached the large iron gate of her home. She knocked softly at first. Tap, tap, then harder. Bang, bang! The gate didn't open. She knocked again, frustration building inside her. Suddenly, a raspy voice called from the other side. "Who is that banging the gate like you want to break it?" It was Musa, the gateman. Mary sighed, trying to stay calm. "It's me, Musa, your madam. Open this gate now." There was silence for a moment before Musa opened the gate just a crack. He poked his head out, his face lit dimly by the faint light above. "Madam, I can't open this gate for you," he said firmly, though his eyes wavered. "Olga told me not to let anyone in, and you said you weren't coming back today." Mary's face tightened with confusion and anger. "Musa, are you serious? Do you know what time it is? Open this gate now or I'll lose my patience." Musa hesitated, but he didn't move. "I'm sorry, madam, I can't." Mary had enough. "Get out of my way," she yelled, pushing Musa aside. He stumbled, nearly falling as Mary squeezed through the gate with her daughter. The house was eerily quiet. Normally, at this hour, someone would be awake, either watching TV or in the kitchen. But tonight, it felt wrong. Mary climbed the stairs slowly, her heart beating faster with every step. She had left her daughter safely in her room. Something didn't feel right. When she reached the door of her bedroom, she paused. The door was slightly ajar, and light spilled out into the hallway. Her hands trembled as she pushed the door open. What she saw made her freeze. There on her bed was her husband, Tom, tangled in sheets with her best friend, Rose. Time seemed to stop. Rose gasped and scrambled to cover herself while Tom slowly sat up, his face calm, too calm. Mary's voice shook as she spoke. "What is going on here? Tom, how could you? And Rose, you, my best friend?" Tom didn't even flinch. "What did you expect, Mary?" he said coldly. "When was the last time we were even a real couple? Every time I come close, you say you're tired, or you're fasting, or off at some night vigil. I'm tired of being ignored." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. "I was doing all that for us. For you! You said you wanted another child, and I was praying for a son." Tom snorted, showing no remorse. "And now I've decided. Rose will be my second wife. She understands me better." Mary felt as though her heart was being ripped from her chest. She sank to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" But Tom didn't answer. He simply walked out of the room, pulling Rose along with him. Mary sat there alone, tears streaming down her face. The room was silent except for her muffled cries. Mary didn't sleep that night. She sat on the cold floor of her empty room, crying so hard it felt like her chest would break. She prayed, begged God for answers, and wailed into the darkness. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of her husband with Rose flashed before her, and the pain came rushing back like a sharp knife. As the first rays of sunlight peeked through her window, Mary wiped her swollen eyes. She knew she couldn't stay in that house any longer. She packed a small bag with just a few clothes for herself and her little daughter, Princess. She didn't have much money, but she didn't care. She just needed to leave. Mary held Princess close as they walked out of the house. Princess looked up at her mother with big, innocent eyes. "Mommy, where are we going?" she asked softly. Mary forced a smile, though her heart was breaking. "We're going to a new home, my love. It's just you and me now, but we'll be okay." She called an agent, explaining her situation. By evening, the agent found her a small, one-room apartment in a crowded neighborhood. It wasn't much, a bed, a tiny table, and a single chair, but it was safe, and it was theirs. Mary sat on the bed that night, hugging Princess tightly. "Mommy, why are you sad?" Princess whispered. Mary kissed her forehead and said, "Don't worry, my darling. God is with us. We'll be fine." The next morning, Mary went to see Pastor Elijah, the man who had always prayed for her family. As she stepped into his small office at the church, tears streamed down her face. "Pastor, my life is falling apart," she began, her voice shaking. "Tom, my husband, he's with Rose, my best friend. I don't know what to do." Pastor Elijah listened quietly, his kind eyes filled with concern. When Mary finished, he took a deep breath. "Sister Mary," he said slowly, "this is not ordinary. Your best friend has charmed your husband. This is a spiritual attack on your marriage, and we must fight back. This is war. a spiritual war, and we must win it through fasting and prayer." Mary looked up, her voice desperate. "I'll do anything, Pastor. I just want my family back." Pastor Elijah nodded. He stood up, placed his hand on her head, and began to pray loudly, his voice echoing through the room. Mary knelt down, tears flowing as he prayed. He spoke in tongues, his words mysterious and powerful. After a few minutes, he opened his eyes. "Listen to me, Sister Mary," he said, his voice firm. "You must fast for 21 days. During this time, you will take only water, no food. Your daughter, Princess, will also join the fast, but she will fast from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. each day. I will fast and pray alongside you." Mary's heart sank at the thought of fasting for so long, especially involving her little girl. But she didn't argue. She was ready to do whatever it took. "Yes, Pastor, I'll do it," she said with determination. Pastor Elijah handed her a small piece of paper. "Here are Bible verses to read during your fast. Trust God. He will fight for you." Mary held the paper tightly, feeling a spark of hope. The next day, Mary began the 21-day fasting and prayer as Pastor Elijah instructed. She locked herself and her 4-year-old daughter, Princess, inside their small room. From sunrise to sunset, Mary prayed, cried, and read her Bible, her voice trembling with desperation. Princess, too young to understand the seriousness of the situation, would tug at her mother's dress and cry, "Mommy, I'm hungry!" But Mary, determined to obey the pastor's words, refused to feed her until 6 p.m. every day. "Hold on, Princess," she would say softly, though her own stomach growled. "God is with us. We have to be strong." The first few days were hard, but by the 5th day, Mary and Princess began to look weak. Mary's once full cheeks were sunken, and her clothes hung loosely on her body. Princess, always full of energy, now spent most of the day lying down, her little face pale and tired. By the 10th day, Mary was barely recognizable. Her thin frame moved slowly as she got out of bed that morning, her body trembling with weakness. Her bones seemed to poke through her skin, but her faith was unshaken. She knelt down, clutching her Bible, and prayed with what little strength she had. Her voice was hoarse, her words broken, but her determination remained strong. "Lord, fight for me," she whispered. "Don't let my enemies win." After praying, she decided to wake Princess to read the Bible with her. She called softly at first, "Princess, wake up, my love, let's read together." There was no response. Mary moved closer to the bed, gently shaking her daughter. "Princess, it's time to wake up," she said, her voice trembling with worry. Still, Princess didn't move. Mary's heart began to race. She touched her daughter's forehead, cold. She shook her harder, her voice rising in panic. "Princess, wake up! Please, wake up!" But Princess lay still. Mary let out a loud, piercing cry. Her screams echoed through the small apartment, and neighbors rushed in to see what was happening. "She's not moving!" Mary sobbed, cradling her daughter. One of the neighbors quickly grabbed his car keys and shouted, "We're taking her to the hospital now!" At the hospital, Princess was rushed into the emergency room. Mary collapsed on the floor in the hallway, her hands shaking as she clutched her Bible. Tears streamed down her face as she rocked back and forth, praying louder than ever. "God, please," she cried, "don't take my baby. Don't let her die." Minutes felt like hours as she waited. She stared at the doors of the emergency room, hoping, praying for a miracle. Finally, the doors opened, and the doctor stepped out. His face was solemn as he approached Mary, who immediately stood up, her heart pounding. "Doctor, how is she? Is my baby okay?" she asked, her voice cracking. The doctor took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, madam. We tried everything we could, but she didn't make it." Mary froze, the words hitting her like a thunderbolt. "No, no, no, no!" she screamed, dropping to the floor. Her wails filled the hospital hallway, her body shaking with grief. Blinded by pain and anger, Mary ran out of the hospital without a word. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she sprinted toward her ex-husband Tom's house. She didn't stop, even as her lungs burned and her legs begged for rest. When she reached the gate, she began banging on it with all her strength. "Tom, come out here! Come and see what you've done!" she screamed. The gateman, startled by her screams, quickly opened the gate. Mary stormed inside, tears streaming down her face. She found Tom sitting in the living room, casually watching television. The sight of him so calm while her world was falling apart pushed her over the edge. "You killed her!" Mary screamed, throwing herself at him. She pounded on his chest with her fists, sobbing uncontrollably. "You killed my baby! You and your wicked ways!" Tom, shocked and overwhelmed, didn't fight back. He fell to the floor, covering his face with his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "Mary, I'm so sorry." But Mary didn't stop. She grabbed his shirt, shaking him as she cried, "Why, Tom? Why did you do this to us? Why did you destroy our family?" Tom's tears fell freely now. He knelt on the floor, guilt and sorrow etched on his face. "I never meant for this to happen," he said softly. I was wrong, Mary. I was so wrong." For hours, Mary sat on the floor of Tom's living room, crying while Tom sat beside her, his head in his hands. The house was silent except for the sound of their grief. Finally, Tom asked, "What happened to Princess? How did she die?" Mary's voice shaking as she explained what had happened. "The pastor said we needed to fast for 21 days. I didn't mean for this to happen, Tom. I just wanted to save our family," she sobbed. Tom's face turned red with rage. He stood up, his fists clenched. "You and that so-called pastor killed my daughter," he roared. "I told you to stop running from church to church. Now you'll take me to that pastor and he will explain himself." Mary tried to speak, but Tom grabbed her arm and pulled her to the car. "Get in!" he barked. Tears streamed down Mary's face as they drove to the church in tense silence. When they arrived at the church, Tom stormed inside, dragging Mary behind him. A church worker tried to stop them. "The pastor is busy right now. He asked not to be disturbed," the worker said nervously. Tom glared at him. "Where is his office?" he demanded. The worker stammered, unsure of what to say. Mary, still crying, pointed toward a door. "That's his office," she whispered. Without waiting another second, Tom burst into the office. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. There, in the pastor's office, was Pastor Elijah and Rose, Mary's best friend. The two of them were locked in an embrace, completely unaware of the chaos outside. "What is this?" Tom roared. Pastor Elijah and Rose jumped apart, their faces pale. Mary, who had followed Tom into the office, gasped so loudly it echoed in the room. She felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Rose? Pastor Elijah?" Mary whispered, her voice trembling. What is happening here?" Rose fell to her knees, crying. "I'm so sorry, Mary," she wailed. Tom stood over Rose, his face filled with disgust. "Start talking!" he shouted. "I want to know the truth now!" Rose looked up at Mary, her tears falling like rain. "Mary, I was jealous of you," she began, her voice shaking. "You had everything I wanted. A loving husband, a happy home. When you told me you were struggling to have another child, I couldn't stand it. I went to Pastor Elijah and we planned to destroy your marriage." Mary's knees buckled and she collapsed into a chair. You did this to me? You were my best friend," she cried. Pastor Elijah stood silently, his head bowed in shame. Tom's rage boiled over. "You ruined my family," he shouted at Rose. He pushed her away in anger, and she fell to the floor, hitting her head hard, and she died. By this time, the commotion had drawn a crowd. Church members gathered outside the office, their faces filled with shock and confusion. Whispers spread quickly as people pieced together the story. Someone called the police, and within minutes, officers arrived at the church. They took Tom, who was still shaking with anger, and Pastor Elijah into custody. That night, as Mary walked back to her small apartment, tears streamed down her face. Her heart felt heavy, like a stone pulling her down into an endless sea of sorrow. Her daughter was gone, her husband was gone, and now, the pastor she trusted had betrayed her. She couldn't stop the images from flashing in her mind. Rose, her best friend, kneeling on the floor, confessing her jealousy, and Pastor Elijah standing in shame. When Mary got home, the silence in the room was unbearable. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching Princess's favorite doll. She stared at the wall, her thoughts running wild. As the night wore on, Mary's mind drifted back to the day she first met Pastor Elijah. It felt like a lifetime ago. She had been at the market with Rose, shopping for groceries. The market was noisy, with people shouting about their goods, the smell of fresh bread and spices filling the air. Mary had been laughing at something Rose said when suddenly a man appeared out of nowhere and stood directly in front of her. "Is your name Mary?" the man asked, his voice calm but serious. Mary froze, staring at him. He was tall, wearing a suit, and carried a Bible in his hand. She had never seen him before. "Yes, I'm Mary. Who are you?" she asked, her voice uncertain. "My name is Pastor Elijah," the man said. "When I saw you, the Holy Spirit spoke to me. He said I should talk to you." Mary's eyes widened in shock. "The Holy Spirit?" she asked, feeling both scared and curious. Pastor Elijah nodded. "You have a daughter, and you've been trying to conceive again, haven't you? The doctors say you're fine, but still, you can't conceive." Mary's heart skipped a beat. How did he know that? She hadn't told anyone except Rose about her struggles. "The problem is spiritual," Pastor Elijah continued. "You must pray to break the chains that are holding you back." Mary was speechless. She felt like this man could see into her soul. Rose, standing beside her, nudged her and said, "Mary, he's a man of God. Listen to him." Feeling a mix of hope and fear, Mary gave him her number. "I'll call you," she said softly. From that day on, Pastor Elijah began giving her spiritual advice. He told her to pray every day, fast for long periods, and even avoid being intimate with her husband for months. Now, sitting on her bed, Mary felt her stomach twist as she remembered everything. "So it was all a setup," she whispered to herself, her voice shaking. She thought about how Pastor Elijah had seemed so kind, so full of wisdom. How he had convinced her to follow all his instructions, saying it was the only way to conceive again. But now she could see the truth. He had been working with Rose all along to destroy her family. Tears rolled down Mary's cheeks as she clutched her chest. "How could I have been so blind?" she cried. "How could I let them do this to me?" Mary didn't sleep that night. She paced the room, her thoughts racing. She replayed every conversation she'd had with Pastor Elijah, every time she had trusted his advice. The pieces started falling into place. "He told me not to be with Tom for months," she muttered. "He kept saying it was part of the prayer, but all he did was drive Tom away." She remembered how distant Tom had become during that time, how he had begged her to stop listening to the pastor. "Mary, this is tearing us apart," he had said. But she hadn't listened. And now, she had lost everything. 2 months had passed since Mary lost her daughter, Princess, and her life had fallen apart. Every day had been filled with tears and pain. Tom, her ex-husband, had been sentenced to 15 years in prison for accidentally killing Rose during the chaotic confrontation. It was a dark time for Mary, but she knew she couldn't stay in that place of sorrow forever. One morning, she stood in front of the mirror, her eyes red from crying, and said to herself, "I can't let this be the end of me. God kept me alive for a reason, and I will find it." With shaky hands but a determined heart, Mary decided to start picking up the pieces of her life. Mary applied for a master's program at a university nearby. She wanted to upgrade her skills and give herself a chance at a brighter future. It wasn't easy, studying while battling her pain, but she pushed through. Day by day, she grew stronger. When Mary graduated, she landed a job at a big company. The salary was great, the office was beautiful, and she finally felt like she was on the path to happiness again. At her new job, Mary's boss was Mr. Jack, a young, handsome man who had inherited the company from his father. Mr. Jack was strict and serious. He rarely smiled and was always focused on work. The ladies in the office admired him, but he barely noticed them. "Mr. Jack is so handsome," one of the ladies whispered to Mary during lunch one day. "I wish he would just look at me once." Mary smiled politely but didn't pay much attention. She wasn't interested in love or relationships. She just wanted to focus on her new life and her faith in God. But something unusual began to happen. Every time Mr. Jack came to Mary's office, his demeanor would change. He would smile at her, ask how she was doing, and even share small jokes. It was a side of him no one else in the office had ever seen. One day, after a meeting, one of Mary's colleagues nudged her and whispered, "Why does Mr. Jack always smile when he talks to you? He doesn't do that with anyone else." Mary laughed nervously. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe he's just being kind." But deep down, Mary noticed it too. Mr. Jack treated her differently, and she couldn't understand why. One day, Mr. Jack called Mary into his office. She walked in, feeling nervous as always when she had to speak with him. "Mary," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I have a question for you." Mary sat down, folding her hands in her lap. "Yes, sir?" He smiled, a rare sight that made her heart skip a beat. "Would you like to have dinner with me?" Mary's eyes widened. She wasn't expecting that. "Dinner? With You? Mr. Jack nodded. Yes, I'd like to get to know you better. Mary hesitated. It had been so long since she had thought about going on a date or spending time with someone in that way, but something in Mr. Jack's eyes told her he was sincere. That dinner was the beginning of something beautiful. Over the next few months, Mary and Mr. Jack grew closer. He treated her with kindness and respect, always making her feel special. He listened to her stories about her past, her struggles, and her faith. He admired her strength and determination. And Mary, who thought she would never find love again, began to see a future with him. 8 months later, on a quiet evening after a lovely dinner, Mr. Jack got down on one knee and held out a ring. "Mary," he said, his voice full of emotion, "you've brought so much light into my life. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Mary's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Mary and Mr. Jack had a beautiful wedding surrounded by friends and family. It was a day filled with joy and laughter, a day Mary thought she would never have again. A year later, they welcomed a baby boy into their lives. Holding her son in her arms, Mary felt a happiness she hadn't known in years. She looked at her husband, her son, and the life they had built together. "Thank you, God," she whispered. "You truly turned my pain into joy." And so, Mary, Mr. Jack, and their little boy lived happily ever after, proving that even the darkest nights can lead to the brightest mornings.